Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm so deeply grateful to have a very special guest with us, Eric Walrabenstein. Eric is an ordained yoga master, best-selling author of Waging Inner Peace, and host of the Perfect Moment podcast. I know Eric as a teacher of meditation and yoga because he trained me in Yoga Nidra because I attended his Yoga Nidra instructor certification training about 5 years ago, and it was absolutely a profound experience for me. Eric, I'm so deeply grateful and excited to have you here with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure to be here.
Would you be willing to share with us a little bit about how you got into this work that you do now?
Sure. It's been about 30 years or so that I've been teaching and practicing yoga and meditation and such. And I came kind of through an unlikely route. Many people know I started my career as a U.S. Army infantry officer. And as I transitioned into the civilian world, I was looking for the next thing. And the thing that really brought me into the world of the military actually is I was seeking for, and I really didn't realize it at the time, but for a connection to something larger than myself. And I was raised in a completely a-spiritual and a-religious environment. So I had no connection in that space. And so I latched on to what seemed to give me a sense of meaning and purpose, and that was the military. And it didn't turn out exactly the way that I thought it would. It didn't feed me, I guess would be a better way to put the way I thought it would. But when I got out, what became evident was that a case of PTSD that I'd been struggling with for many years from a mugging back when I was 17 years old began to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And I was living in San Francisco at the time. And one thing led to another. And I tried everything from, therapy to medications to on and on and on and on. And long story short, that's what brought me first to meditation. I became a student at the San Francisco Zen Center, and then to yoga, mostly, and this is kind of ironic given the work that I do today, mostly due to a persistent chronic back pain problem was the yoga piece. But in any event, both of those worlds kind of came together and one thing led to another. And before you know it, I'm teaching because it was so effective for me. And about maybe 22 years ago, I decided to leave the corporate world behind and moved to Arizona, and I started Yogapura here in the state.
Thank you for sharing that. I think some of the people listening have experienced their own forms of PTSD, whether it's from childhood trauma or events in their late teens or earlier life. And so I'm curious, how can things like yoga, yoga nidra, and so on, how can they help people with releasing some of those stressors from the past?
I think one of the most helpful things to remember is that the brain and nervous system, I'll just go with the brain because it's all one big thing really, is a programmed and programmable mechanism. And so as we roll through life, we're always programming ourselves or being programmed by our experiences. Sometimes that programming is helpful and sometimes that programming is unhelpful. And so I have this vision in my head that I share with people sometimes that I find helpful. And you remember back in the old cartoons, they used to have a cartoon character rolling down a snowy hill in a snowball, and that snowball would get bigger and bigger and bigger and would pick up little pieces of everything that it rolled through. Our brains and nervous systems are not all that different from that, in that everything that we experience has some impact. So as we have, and in my particular case, I was attacked in a parking garage in Sacramento, California by a gang of people. And that left a mark in my nervous system. And that mark is something that we've come to call PTSD. So it's a rather deep mark. But in the same way that my nervous system learned to respond to the world in that way because of the attack, it can also unlearn that. because it's always learning. Now, of course, some things like PTSD, as an example, are more difficult to unlearn. But we need to remember that, again, the brain and the nervous system are always they're a programmed and programmable mechanism. So it's always possible to make movement in the direction that we want to if we use the right techniques and practices. And those techniques and practices are expressly what yoga is all about. And most people think of it as a spiritual practice or a physical practice, but it's a practice that's designed to change the way that our brains and nervous systems function. And that can be used for spiritual purposes, but can also be used for purposes of just living a happier and more productive life.
And so you spoke about being programmed, if you will, by these intense emotional experiences. And would you be willing to speak to kind of our programming, even from other experiences in our life that we might not consider to be big T traumas like you've experienced, like a mugging, but little T traumas like perhaps a parent or a caregiver saying something or us experiencing something on the playground? How do these programs, if you will, impact us, and what can we do about them?
Well, keep in mind that the programming isn't all negative, right? So like I was programmed by my mother to say thank you to people who do things for me, right? That's programming. And all of the things that we've come to believe and the habits that we've formed, whether they're positive or negative, are parts of what I'm calling programming in the brain and the nervous system. That's the way the whole thing works. And so everything from your domineering father criticizing you constantly to your uncle saying you're the best thing since sliced bread and everything in between, all of these things have an impact on the nervous system. And it reminds me when I was studying at San Francisco Zen Center, I was a young, brash 27 or 28-year-old at the time. And I remember we were supposed to be being mindful, of course, because we're in the Zen Center and we're doing our practices and stuff. And I was goofing off a little bit. And my Zen teacher at the time, he called me over and he chastised me. And he basically said, that's not what mindfulness is. And I said, well, I'm not practicing right now. There's kind of a smoke. What's it called? A smoke shield. No, that's not what, you know what I mean. Smoke screen. That's what I'm trying to think of. So as a smoke screen, I said, well, I'm not practicing right now. And he looked at me in the eye and he said, Eric, you're always practicing something. You're either practicing being more mindful or you're practicing being more distracted. You're even practicing being more positive or you're practicing being more negative. Because the brain and the nervous system are like sponges and they're always being impacted. There's no off time. And so when we understand this, then the real opportunity and the real value in understanding this is then we all can become the agents of our own programming. We can begin to engage in the kinds of practices, engage in the kinds of behaviors, engage in the kind of speech, engage in the kinds of readings that fill us or that program us in a way that's going to lead to a happier, more peaceful life, more than a distracted and more angst-ridden life.
Thank you. And what do we know from kind of the Eastern traditions, if you will, around those belief systems or programs? And I know in our training we refer to them as samskaras, if that's the correct term. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, samskara, as we call it in yoga, is really just a little bit of mental programming. Samskara literally translates as either impression or activator. And the way that the brain works, and many people have probably heard this little pithy phrase before, neurons that fire together, wire together. That's the kind of the crux of what's called Hebbian theory. And what it really means is that as the brain is asked to either think a particular thought or to do a particular behavior, the more times that it does that, the deeper the tendency is that it will do that again. And this is how habits are formed. habits of smoking, habits of saying thank you to people, habits of a particular way of thinking, whether that's a positive way or a negative way. And so it's really about understanding that these samskaras are what's driving the way that we're experiencing our world. And when we do that, then there's an opportunity to change them. And then we stay over in the Western world for a moment, because Hebbian theory came from the world of neuroscience, is that the evolution of that is neuroplasticity, which states that the brain is a plastic organism, that is, it can be changed. And that's right back to it's always being programmed, or we could also say it's always learning. And so taking advantage of that is really at the core of what yoga's practices and Buddhism's practices are really all about, because it's really, if we want to talk about it in spiritual context, a quiet inner state, or we could say profound inner peace, is the doorway to what people will either call divine connection or spiritual realization or self-realization or whatever it is, no matter what the tradition.
Thank you. And so I'm curious, how do those programs, samskaras, if you will, impact what we perceive in our world to be real?
It's a really good question. And I like to think of samskaras, and this is not true of all of them, but many of them, as lenses. And they're lenses that we're looking through. And just like the lenses that are on the glasses on my face right now, they are changing the way I perceive things. They're skewing the way that I'm perceiving whatever I'm looking at. And so an example would be, back when I got mugged, when I was that 17-year-old kid, immediately a samskara was created that people who looked like the gang of people who attacked me were dangerous. And that samskara, again, we want to think of it like a lens, like I'm wearing a pair of glasses. Now, every time I look at people who look like my attackers, I instantly had anxiety well up within me. That wasn't the case before I was attacked. And so that attack left me with this lens that I'm looking through. And here's the interesting thing is most of us, well, all of us, we're looking through all sorts of different lenses we don't even know that we're looking through. And so we think that we're seeing the truth, but what we're really seeing is the truth skewed by the samskaras or by the lenses. And when we are acting in that way, that's where a lot of bigotry and fear and unnecessary division comes from, is because people believe, and you look in the political landscape today, you have people on both sides being 100% irrational and believing that they're being 100% rational because of the samskaras that they happen to be looking through. And it makes it all look like it makes sense to them. So that's one of the most powerful ways that they work, and a really important way to awaken to, because as we begin to notice that, we can also begin to do something about it.
So how can people notice that? Because I imagine that many of us are unconscious to a lot of those things, unless, of course, like you said, there's a big trauma and then you can correlate the cause and the effect. So how can we become more aware, and then how can we release those ones that are not serving us?
There's a practice in yoga called svadhyaya, which translates loosely as self-study. And it is the intention to understand more and more intimately why I feel like I feel, why I think what I think, why I say what I say, and why I do what I do. And it's really a commitment to being interested and curious about how this thing works. And the question that you ask, it's a really important one, but it's also a little bit tricky to answer because there's really not a silver bullet per se. But when we look at all, I'm going to say all, maybe it's most, but we'll go with all for now, transformative modalities, whether they're spiritual modalities or therapeutic modalities, there's always a significant aspect of it which asks us to understand ourselves better. And and I think it's really important also to remember that when we say we want to understand ourselves by ourselves, what we really want to understand is the processes that are happening under the hood of this body-mind organism. And so the first step is that commitment to pay attention and to ask questions like, why did that trigger me? Or why do I feel so negative even though I'm in the top 1% of people on the planet? And on and on and on and on. And it really starts with that kind of curiosity, but of course it helps to have a more comprehensive, some help, we could say, whether that's in a system or with a teacher or with clergy or whatever it is. But it's really that it starts with a curiosity.
Thank you. And what are some of those questions that we can ask ourselves? So you mentioned, for example, what is triggering me about this? What are some other questions for those of us that want to become more self-aware that we can begin to ask ourselves?
Well, if you will allow me, I'll take a step back first.
Please.
And that is to say that I think the first and maybe most important realization, at least in the early stages, is to recognize that your frustration, your irritation, your anger, your impatience is not coming from the outside. It's coming from the inside. And where most of us get stuck, and it's no fault of ours, it's the way that we were raised, is that we have somehow become convinced that I'm angry because of him, and I'm impatient because of her, and I'm frustrated because of that, and on and on and on it goes. And while it is true that those things around us can trigger us, the actual manufacturing of the anger or the frustration or the anxiety, whatever it is happening in your brain and nervous system. And it's happening because of the programming that lives in your brain and nervous system. And so every single moment of every day, your brain and nervous system and my brain and nervous system are literally manufacturing our thoughts and our feelings out of the raw materials of our experience. And that word or phrase, raw materials, is really important because a raw material could be anything. You could have a hunk of steel, which is a raw material, and you can turn that into an assault rifle to kill people, or you could turn it into a plow to feed people. And it's the same thing of my circumstance in this moment and the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. It's my brain and nervous system is using the raw material of that circumstance and then converting it into whatever thoughts and emotions that I'm having. And here's the most important part. If you rely, well, back up. Let's look at the math of this for a moment, right? So the mathematics of it. The mathematics say that there's a circumstance, and you add the circumstance plus the programming or tendencies or habits that live in my brain and nervous system, something we call samskaras in yoga, equals, let's go with, in this case, frustration. So I have a circumstance plus my program equals frustration. And let's say the circumstance is a traffic jam. And my programming says the traffic shouldn't be going only 15 miles an hour on the freeway, and that's going to yield frustration. In that moment, if you're really serious about being happy, you have only one option, because you cannot change the circumstance in the moment. You can only change your reaction to the circumstance. And so when I transmute my thought that this shouldn't be like this into something else, like this is okay for now, or I give the traffic full permission to be the way it is for now, then that changes the dynamics of it changes the entire mathematical equation. And so instead of traffic plus resistance equals frustration, we get traffic plus nothing equals traffic. And traffic, let's face it, is just you sitting in a comfortable seat listening to music. There's nothing really in it to irritate you. And so when we talk about, as you asked earlier, about this process of being more introspective and understanding ourselves, it's these kinds of processes that really count when it comes to understanding ourselves. Because once you understand that equation, you can begin to manage it. But back to my original point here is that if you're relying on changing the traffic and changing the spouse and changing the economy and changing the politicians and changing the climate in order to be happy, you're going to have a real tough road to hoe. Because for those of you who have not been paying attention, the universe does not often cooperate. Well, at least maybe I find it doesn't cooperate 51% of the time. And so if that's the only strategy you have for finding happiness or inner peace or connection, it's going to be really difficult. And that's why it's so important to do this inner work. Because that's where we're most empowered.
Thank you, Eric. And what's kind of active for me right now in this moment is a conversation I had yesterday with someone. This is a gentleman that came up to me about 2 weeks ago after I did a keynote on resilience. And he shared that his son and his daughter-in-law had twins. One of the twins had passed away immediately, and the other one was not doing well. And then yesterday, unfortunately, the second little baby passed. And so as I hear you speak about kind of the situation and the samskara and the feeling, I'm thinking, what can you suggest for people who are experiencing grief, whether it is grief for a person, maybe a pet, maybe a situation, a job, a relationship in their life? Because they may say, well, what program might, be creating the pain that I'm having? It's the loss, and I couldn't do anything about that. What might you suggest in those situations?
There's a few things that arise. The first is to recognize that grief is a normal and natural process that we go through, and that everybody grieves in a different way based upon who they are, and back to this idea of the programming that lives in their brain and the nervous system. And it's very important that people engage in that grieving process in a way that is conscious and optimized for healing. And what I mean by that is that in the moment that I'm grieving, it's not possible for me to make my grief better, but it is possible for me to make my grief a lot worse. And the way that I make that grief worse is by this habit that we all have to some extent, is something that I call, and by habit, it's a samskara that I call psychological resistance. And it is this single repetitive thought that this should not be like this. And that single repetitive thought, whether this should not be like this is the traffic moving 15 miles an hour in the fast lane, or this should not be like this because I lost a loved one, or this should not be like this because I'm experiencing grief. Anytime we allow the mind to go to war with reality, we're going to add suffering on top of the pain. Pain is part of the deal. It's a mandatory part of life. We're going to lose people. We're going to have things are not going to go our way. All sorts of things are going to come down the pike that are really not, or they're on the negative side of the ledger, if we will. But how we react to them determines whether or not we have just the pain of the experience, or we're layering layers and layers and layers and layers of optional suffering on top of it. So on top of the grief, I may layer regret, and then frustration, and then anger with myself about what I said or didn't said or could have done or couldn't have done, and then impatience about the grief not resolving itself fast enough, and a whole slew of what if scenarios, and on and on and on, all because I'm not in a optimally functional relationship with either the event or the grief that's arising naturally as a result of the event. So this is back once again to this idea of understanding the mechanics of how my brain and nervous system are manufacturing my feelings out of the experience. And again, the more awake we are to how that process is, the more empowered we become.
This is so incredibly important what you're sharing with us today, because I imagine everyone listening has had their form of loss in life. And, this idea that grief is natural, and right, we can soften or limit the amount of layers that we add on to that grief that would extend it in terms of time and also intensify the expression of the grief in our body and emotionally. So let's say we become aware of what some of those layers are, what some of those thoughts are, like the samskara of, this shouldn't be happening, or this isn't fair, or whatever that is for us. What can we do at that point to lessen some of that pain? What can we do to shift those thoughts?
Here's a question that helps me quite a bit. When I'm hip deep or earlobe deep in the middle of some really uncomfortable situation, and I find myself knocked off balance, I ask myself, how can I come into the most harmonious relationship with what's happening possible? And that goes for if I'm sitting in traffic and I'm fuming because I'm late for a dental appointment, or if I've lost a loved one in my family, and anything in between. If we watch ourselves, we'll see ourselves sometimes filled with anything that, from frustration to impatience to anger or what have you. And right in the middle of that, if I can pause and ask myself, how can I come into the most harmonious relationship with this possible? I can then begin to look around and see, okay, I'm going to war with it in this way. I'm perpetuating the narrative by replaying this in my mind. I'm telling everybody who will listen to me about this particular situation, this problem. And what I'm basically doing is creating an experience that is 100% made up of this episode that I'm not really keen on, rather than doing something else. So that single question helps me quite a bit. And I will also add, I said the most harmonious relationship possible, not perfect harmony, because everything in this realm of whatever we want to call it, personal development, I like to think of it as self-mastery. It's a game of increments. It's about not moving from being perfectly miserable to perfectly happy. It's moving from perfectly 100% miserable to 99% miserable. And people dismiss that 1% as if, oh, it's just 1%. But here's what you have to hear. If that I moved from 100% miserable to 99% miserable and nothing around me changed, I just proved to myself that I have it within me to synthesize a different experience out of the same circumstance. And if I could move 1% my first time out of the gate with a little bit of practice and the right teachers and the right intention, I can turn that 1% into 10 and into 20, into 30, and 50, and on and on and on it goes over time. So that's another really important reminder is whenever we are doing this work, it's really important to look for, I call them the glimpses, right? The little teeniest movement that might only be so small you barely notice it, and it might only last for 2 seconds. But that glimpse is proof that you can synthesize a different experience, even in the midst of the same circumstance.
And it's a reminder to all of us to appreciate the efforts that we are doing. And as you said, it demonstrates to us and to our unconscious mind that something that we did inside of it had an effect on how we're feeling and our experience. So I'm curious, Eric, many of us have heard of karma. What does karma mean to you? And what, if anything, does it have to do with what we're speaking about, like when bad things happen in our life?
Karma, the understanding of karma is one of the, in my view, the most important understandings anybody can have when it comes to living their best and happiest life, whether they're interested in spiritual development or just being a fully empowered human being. And it's also one of the most radically misunderstood concepts in all of spirituality. So let's start with what it's not. It's not some divine accountant sitting up in the sky with a ledger, keeping track of what you've done right and what you've done wrong, and then meting out some sort of retribution for that. It is simply a law, like the law of gravity. And in this case, it's the law of cause and effect. For every cause, there is an effect. And that effect then becomes a cause for the next thing, which creates another effect, and on it goes. And it's happening outside of us. Like when somebody bumps into somebody, somebody else falls down. But it's more importantly happening inside of us. And that understanding of karma, the karma that's happening inside of you, is, again, where you make your money in this game. The karma that's happening inside of you, we've already been talking about. Remember, it's cause and effect. And so when this body-mind organism runs into some traffic, that experience of being in traffic bumps into my mind's habit or programming or samskara about how it reacts to traffic. And that results in effect called, could be frustration, could be nothing at all, depending upon the programming. So the sum total of the samskaras that live in your mind, again, some helpful, some unhelpful, is your karma. And so it's, and this is the really important part, which means it's in your control. Because this kind of conventional misunderstanding of karma as some either divine retribution or some just what comes around goes around thing is that it's a disempowering, and it's not only disempowering, but it's not accurate view of what karma is. And so when we really understand that it's really a game of programming, then I can choose to engage again in the right practices and look at the right things and talk to the right people, hang out in the right crowds, get the right teachers, do whatever I need in order to begin to alter my karma, alter my samskaras, alter my mind's programming and habits and beliefs in a way that serves me rather than pulls me down.
And so what if someone thinks, okay, if I label those samskaras, my inner experience or response, if you will, to what's happening, and I label the frustration, that I'm giving that more energy, which is going to create more of what I don't want, right? Sometimes I hear people saying, well, I don't want to look at my limiting thought patterns or, my depression or my whatever suffering it is, because I worry, right? They've heard of the law of attraction. I worry about attracting more pain and suffering into my life. What might you say to those individuals?
The first thing I will say is it is a fair point, is that what you think and what you focus on does matter greatly. And it's also true that if I have a samskara that is making me overly negative, that if I'm swimming in a sea of blessings, I have a tendency to focus on the one thing that's going wrong, which is a strong tendency for us all, most of us anyway. If I just say, I don't want to look at that and turn my back on it, it doesn't mean it's not still operating on me. It just means that I'm allowing it to operate on its own in the background of my life. But I'm still going to experience the same negative effects from it. So it behooves me to become conscious of that samskara, of that habit, and then to take deliberate and intentional steps to counter it. And when I do that, then I begin to fit what we call, and we say in yoga, to fill in the samskara, or we could also say reduce the intensity of the habit in favor of another habit that may be serving me better. Now, with all of that said, you can overdo that, and you can keep your nose in all of the negativity or all of your so-called bad habits or samskaras to the degree in which you're overwhelmed by negativity, and that's not going to be helpful either. So there's definitely a balance there. But for my money, turning your back on these mental and emotional operators is a pretty significant risk.
There's a famous phrase, what you resist persists. Looking at those parts of us, maybe those shadow, darker, if you will, parts of us, might be the gateway to set them free.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, would you be willing to share a little bit more about energy? So, you talked about kind of the mind, body. What do our listeners need to know? What would you have wanted to know earlier on in your life, perhaps, around energy and the importance of moving energy in the body?
Well, the first thing to remember is that everything's energy. Everything from the words that I'm speaking to the images that the light images that my eyes are seeing, to the thoughts that I'm experiencing, to the table that my computer is sitting on. It's all energy that is more or less condensed depending upon its form. So in a manner of speaking, there isn't a you and there isn't a me. This is just one big field of energy soup, and Western science has proven this out. With that said, we do have an impact on how we either respond to that energy, or maybe more, how do I want to put this? More helpfully, we can manage the energy of which this body-mind organism is made. And so that has to do, again, with managing the energy that is thoughts, managing the energy that is breath, managing the energy that is the physicality, and on it goes. And for me, there are a number of what I call points of leverage where we can affect significant and oftentimes immediate change in our feeling state simply by using these points of leverage. So one of the most obvious ones is the breath. And there is a different breath pattern for every mental and emotional state. And if you care to, and I always tell people, don't believe a word I say, check this out for yourself. If you notice next time you are nice and happy and sitting in a hot tub with friends, check in with your breath, and you'll notice there's a particular pattern to that breath, as opposed to when you're sitting at your desk behind on a deadline and anxious, there's a different pattern. And when you stub your toe in the corner of a coffee table, there's a different pattern. The good news is that even though everything that I think and everything that I feel has an effect on the breath, it's also true that everything that's happening in the breath also goes both ways. It's affecting my body and my mind too. So by changing the pattern of my breath towards one that mimics the pattern that I have when I'm calm and relaxed, it's going to have an effect on both my mind and my body. And so breath, using it intentionally, is one of these points of leverage. Another one that is also super powerful and equally superly underutilized by people is where I place my attention. In every moment of the day, I get my attention is like a camera, and I can choose to point this camera of attention at the 24-hour news, or I can choose to point it at my little puppy dog, or I can choose to point it at a thought about all the people who love me, or I can choose to point it at a thought about how I failed at something. And of course, because it's a karmic chain, where I put my attention creates a certain kind of thought, certain kind of thought creates a certain kind of motion, certain kind of motion creates a certain kind of feeling, that certain kind of feeling creates a tendency to say or do a certain thing. That's the internal chain of karma. And so by choosing to deliberately place my attention on things that are serving me, and this isn't to say, by the way, that you should put your head in the sand and never attend to problems, but it is to say, if you are honest and you look at your life, you'll probably see that you are spending way more time focusing on problems in circumstances in which you can do nothing about them, and you're really just self-creating optional misery for yourself for no good reason. So if I use my attention to fix a problem, and sure, that might be a little bit uncomfortable, but once I'm done fixing the problem, or I've come to a log jam where it's clear that I can't fix that problem in this moment, then change the channel, put my attention on something that's going to serve me. So those are just two examples. And because, again, the original question was energy management, this is all energy. And so I can manage this energy by using the breath. I can manage this energy by where I choose to place my attention are just two of the, I think, the most helpful ways to start for people.
Thank you, Eric. And one of the things that you trained me on as part of our Yoga Nidra certification training is on intention, the power of intention. What, if anything, do you think is important to share about that here today?
I think the biggest issue for so many of us is that we have become victims of our circumstances rather than architects of our experience. And let me define those two words as I use them. Circumstances, the circumstances of your life, the job you have, the relationship you're in, the bank account balance, your health status, all of that. Your experience is how you feel in this moment. And most people are victims of their circumstances in that they believe that their circumstances are dictating their inner experience. That when I get laid off, I have to feel bad. I have to be scared. I have to do this. Or when somebody says something to me that's unkind, it's a fait accompli that I'm going to be miserable. And while it seems like that's true, it's not necessary. Because again, as we talked about earlier, the brain and the nervous system are manufacturing these thoughts and feelings, not the people around us. And if I take control of the programming that's in the brain and the nervous system, it can use these same raw materials to synthesize, to create or manufacture a completely different internal experience. So when I say most people are victims of their circumstances, is that they're allowing their circumstances to dictate how they feel instead of architecting how they want to feel independent of their circumstances. And two of the ways we do that, I just described through using points of leverage like the breath and like where you place your attention. And of course, these are just two of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different techniques and processes that we use in yoga. But the real takeaway here is that we have way more control over how we feel, how happy we are, how clear we are, how plugged into intuition we are, how connected we feel to source and to others we are, than we've been taught. And that is the crux of what the practices of yoga are all about.
And it brings so much hope, Eric. Now, for those of us that may be in that suffering place or have people around them in their life that are suffering, to know that we can, through the breath, through our focus or attention and other techniques, choose to feel differently by reshaping the thoughts that are correlated with the situation or event that's going on in our life. And that is, I think, the essence of empowerment.
Yes, absolutely. And do you mind if I do a little hair splitting?
Please.
Because what you just said is 100% correct. You said we can choose to feel differently by programming our mind. But the chain of events is really, we can choose to change the programming. And that will yield us feeling differently. And the reason that I'm splitting those hairs is because a lot of people come at this and they're told, oh, you can choose happiness. And you can't. You can't choose happiness. What you can choose is you can choose what you're looking at, and you can choose to, over time, change the way your brain and your nervous system process what you're looking at so that it yields happiness. And so when people like the Hallmark Corporation with their nice little cards get too, they're nice and they're clever and they make us feel good, but they also can be misleading. So it's really important to understand the process that we're wanting to engage in, because that's where the real empowerment for the transformation comes from. So thanks for indulging me on my hair splitting.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very grateful that you shared that and that you reminded us that it's a process. So it's not
Absolutely.
going from 100% to 0% suffering or frustration or anger or sadness or whatever it is. It's a process. And the important thing is to stay focused on doing what we can to feel better, to stay alert and conscious as to our inner experiences, our thoughts, and to utilize tools like yoga, yoga nidra, within them, of course, the breath and many other modalities, to do what we can to shift moment by moment by moment, because we can feel better.
Absolutely. And the other thing that comes up for me when you said that was to remind people it doesn't need to take years. Sometimes it doesn't need to take months. If you find the right teacher, you engage in the right process with the right intention and the right effort, I've seen literally miracles happen. People who have been, I'm thinking of a student of mine, Liz Garcia, who I have permission to share her story because it's just so amazing. She came to me completely ready to be off of this planet. She had been struggling with OCD and depression and years of therapy and doctors and medications. Her whole family life was falling apart. She didn't feel like she was worthy of anything. And we sat together and we put together a process, and I am not exaggerating in the least, in 15 weeks, you couldn't recognize her. She was back to this bubbly, smiley, grateful, engaged mom and wife, and totally empowered in 15 weeks. And I'm still in touch with her. This was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And she's still in that bubbly, happy place. Now, this isn't to say that it's going to be 15 weeks for everybody, but I think that a lot of people, let me back up and say the reason that it was 15 weeks for Liz is because she was sick and tired. She was ready. And she actually looked at me now, you tell me what to do, and I don't care what it is, but I'll do it. Because the other thing too is this wasn't the first go around with me. She came to my yoga studio and took some of my courses maybe 4 or 5 years earlier, but she didn't commit. And this one, she said, I need to talk to you privately, looked me in the eyes and said, I can't take it anymore. I'm willing to do anything you tell me. And so we put together an intensive process, and it was her intention and energy to engage in that this could have dragged out for 10 years or 5 years or 3 years, but it didn't. It was 15 weeks because of her commitment to herself. So for anybody who's listening, who is feeling either hopeless or worried that it could take forever, I want you to hear that there is huge possibility for transformation waiting for everybody. And it can, and this is right from the Yoga Sutras, actually, one of yoga's source documents, is that the results that you get are completely dependent upon you, the intensity of your effort, and you're willing to dedicate yourself to a process. So there's hope for everybody.
Thank you, Eric. And I know from your book that you've helped literally thousands and thousands of troops to overcome PTSD and the horrors that they'd experienced. And so you've proven to us that it absolutely is possible. And I invite our listeners to engage with you, with all of the resources that you have available. You have an incredible YouTube channel. Your podcast is excellent. And I know that you have a special gift for our listeners. Would you be willing to share a little about what that is?
I sure would. It's called Yoga's Secret to Calm. And it's a couple of different things all put together in a little package. The first thing is there's a guided Yoga Nidra meditation audio recording. This is the exact same one that I've used with over 6,000 US service members to help them heal from PTSD. So it's super powerful. Second thing is there's a little learning video with it to help you get the most out of the recording. And the third thing is there's a daily journal. And for those of you who don't like journaling, like I don't like journaling, let me tell you that this one is a fill in the blank journal, which is really simple to help you set attention in the morning and stay connected to your intention to feel lighter and happier and more connected throughout your day. So it's really, really easy to use. So that whole package is called Yoga's Secret to Calm. And if you would like to get it, absolutely free, of course, you can scurry on over to my website at ericwall.com/gift. And I'd be happy to send that along to you.
Eric, with a heart full of love and gratitude, I want to share my appreciation for all of the wonderful, timeless wisdom and strategies that you've shared with us today. I imagine that you not only gave hope for people listening, but also have given them specific practical things that they can ask themselves, that they can explore, that they can practice to help them and others in their life feel even better. Because, as you said, we don't have to suffer. It is a choice, and there is a process for healing. So, thank you.
Oh, you're so very welcome. And thanks for everything that you're doing as well. Just really beautiful to be here.